Welcome to Taking the Tradition On, a series of conversations about oral storytelling with extraordinary people. We are currently on series 4. It's gone so quickly. I can't believe we're on series 4 already. And this series is Words in the Works. It's exploring the role of applied storytelling in all sorts of different spheres and careers. All the previous episodes are on the YouTube channel, Taking the Tradition On, so you can go and explore those at will. And if you like them, please do press the subscribe button. And as always, I would love to thank my marvellous patrons who help make this possible. And if you would like to join them, then you would be very welcome there as well. And you just need to go to amydouglas.com. You need to go to Patreon, Amy Douglas. In fact, actually, Patreon/Amy Douglas. I'll get there eventually. I'm so bad at telling people about Patreon, I can't even remember what it is, but it's Patreon/Amy Douglas. Now for the important bit. My guest tonight is somebody that I've been very privileged to know on and off over seas and over different continents for 30 years, and we are going to be looking at storytelling within the library service with the outstanding Janice Del Negro. Janice is an American storyteller based in Chicago. She's a nationally acclaimed storyteller, a recipient of the National Storytelling Network Storytelling Circle of Excellence. She's had a long and distinguished career in the American Library Service and is currently professor at the School of Information Studies at the Dominican University, Illinois, teaching both a master's and PhD students in library and information studies. There's pages more of her CV that I'm not going to go into now because I think it is time for you to just give it up, go wild, whoop whoop on the chat for the wonderful Janice Del Negro.
Thank you very much, Miss Amy. I look very good on paper.
I think you look very good in real life too.
Thank you. I am equally privileged, just so you know. So there.
So you have had two parallel careers. I met you as a storyteller, but you've been within the library service for at least 30 years, and you were very established and well known then. So I don't want to ask exactly how long, but it has been a long time, and I think you've seen a lot of changes in that time. So four decades.
41 years.
Wow.
Oh God, that makes me feel very old. Okay, that's fine. It's fine.
Which came first, though, storytelling or libraries? Which claimed your heart first?
That's such an interesting question. They sort of came together, really. When I was a child, I spent a lot of time at the Throgs Neck branch of the New York Public Library, which was this little storefront on a very busy urban street. And I was one of those children that was going to read all the fiction in alphabetical order. And I used to get really irritated when people brought books back because it meant I had to back up and read something I hadn't read. So I was doing this for a while, and the librarian there, who scared me to death, really, completely unintentionally on her part. One day she came over and she took me by the shoulders and she walked me over to the nonfiction section where I never went. And she stood me in front of the 398.2s and she said, "Here, read these." And I read all of them. And so I spent a lot of time at the library. My father was ill, and there was, the library was a really nice place. And I spent a lot of time there. And I spent a lot of time there with folk and fairy tales. And I must have been about 10. And I think I sort of moved into the 398.2s and I never really left. So
we're not all librarians here, so you may need to explain that a little bit more.
398.2s are folk and fairy tales from around the world. And they are, there are an enormous number of collections, and libraries used to collect folk tales as a matter of fact because they use them as sources for stories for telling. So that was so you could get a pretty good 398 collection just about anywhere you went back in the day, like in the 60s and 70s. I'm not so sure you can say that now.
So, and obviously tonight we are focusing on the library service in
Right.
America because I was also one of those children. I absolutely adored the library. I couldn't walk to a library, so I maybe didn't get there quite as often. And I also spent a lot of time in second-hand bookstores. And I think I was in the time when library services in Britain and schools as well were getting rid of folk and fairy tales, uh,
Mm,
and and so I picked up lots that were sort of 10p second hand, and I fell in love with them there. But I don't I don't think, and certainly we're only just maybe getting to that in libraries now. I'm not sure that we do have that same thing of world folk and fairy tales being a necessary source in
yeah,
libraries. And I love that you say they collected them for source stories for telling. So did
right.
you hear stories then at the library when you were going in? Were the people
I
telling
never did. They did at this particular library, they did preschool programming, and I was past that. So the first time I actually heard somebody tell a story, oh my God, I went to the National Storytelling Festival in Jonesboro, Tennessee, just on a whim in 1981, I think. I went with a whole bunch of people in a van, which should probably be a story, but anyway, um, it was remarkable. Well, you were there. It's a remarkable event. There's tents everywhere and thousands of people come to listen to stories, and there are a remarkable number of tellers. Um, I heard uh, uh, I heard so many librarian tellers at the time because the storytelling revival in the States began around in the 70s, but the only people who knew what storytelling was were librarians who worked with youth and had been, knew about storytelling, took storytelling in graduate school. And so the libraries were a very hospitable place for storytellers to find work. And for a while, there was a lot of storytelling happening in libraries and schools. So the library was a very soft place to land for a lot of tellers then.
So that's incredibly exciting to me that you were taught storytelling as
Oh yeah,
part of your training as a librarian. Now, I'm not a librarian, and I don't know the ins and outs of the British Library Service. I may speak out of turn, I may get things wrong. That we might have librarians with us here tonight. Feel free to correct me. But I mean, so yes, there were the storytelling times for like toddler times, but it would usually
right,
be somebody reading a book,
right,
and the thought that, kind of you went to a festival and it was mostly librarian tellers and people that have been trained in libraries to tell is a wonderful and amazing idea to me. And the I hesitate to say revival, because it's a bit of a controversial word in Britain. In how can you revive something that isn't dead? I think it was kind of on life support for a while, so maybe resurgence. The resurgence of storytelling in
resurgence is
Britain
good.
was after America. I think we're kind of 20 years behind. And yes, I did go to the National, and I think it was 93 when I went. And at that year, we had just set up Festival at the Edge. It was in its third year. I think the first Beyond the Border festival had just happened. I was on my apprenticeship as an 18-year-old, exploring storytelling, trying to learn more about it, staying with lots of different storytellers. And I went to America to see what the storytelling scene in America was like.
Right.
And I arrived at this
Excuse
festival,
me.
its 21st year, with tents that held thousands of people. It had not occurred to me that storytelling could be so big. And I think if I was to say that most of the storytellers here had come from a specific place, later
Right,
on I found, um, I connected with Duncan and all of the traveller storytellers. So a lot of people had never stopped telling, and there was a lot of amazing
right.
oral tradition traveller storytellers. The resurgence tellers, I would say, were mostly in schools and had come from schools. And I
Right.
think that schools maybe played that kind of role in Britain. Libraries as funding, but I think libraries would be more likely to have somebody in-house who would sit and read a book. So tell me more about how this worked in the library, like
It's
the storytelling collective.
initially when librarians first started telling stories at the turn of the 20th century in libraries, they were concentrating on school-age children. They were working with the reading child. They were not working with preschoolers until a little later in the 20th century. But when Anne Carroll Moore became the director of youth services for the New York Public Library, she had heard Marie Shedlock, who was English, living in France, educated in Germany. She came to the United States to tour, telling stories. She was a Hans Christian Andersen interpreter, and she did ladies' luncheons and college reading groups and libraries. And the head of the Pratt Institute School, the Pratt Institute Public Library, invited Anne Carroll Moore to come and hear Marie Shedlock tell stories. And Anne Carroll Moore was never a storyteller. She never told, but she really liked storytelling, and she thought that there was really a place for it in the library. And the New York Public Library was one of the biggest urban libraries in the country. And between New York and Pittsburgh, they had to fight it out over who did the first story time. But anyway, I don't care. So
it's great they're both doing them.
They were both doing them. But what they were doing was they were trying to train librarians to tell stories to the reading child, because the function early on was to promote reading, right? And there was sort of a rule at New York that you couldn't tell a story that wasn't in a book, because the purpose of the program was to promote the resources in the library, which is not unusual. But it did have a few problems because it meant that somebody like Pura Belpre, who was the first Puerto Rican children's librarian at the New York Public Library, couldn't tell the stories that she knew from growing up until she got special dispensation from the New York Public Library to do it. But as a result of that, later she wrote, 2 collections and a couple of picture books, so that they were in books and anybody else could tell them. Right. She did the first bilingual story programs, big family programs. So Anne Carroll Moore, backing up just a little bit, in around 1908, I think, hired Anna Cogswell Tyler to be the official storyteller. And she became the storyteller for the New York Public Library, who also trained other children's librarians to tell. And they were very stand and deliver, right? It wasn't that they were not animated or didn't do things in the telling. It was that the concentration really was on the story, because the the notion was that if you knew the story well enough, you couldn't really mess it up too badly, right? So no matter what kind of teller you were. So it's really kind of fun. But the purpose,
I kind of would agree with that to a certain extent, though, I have to say, because traditional stories,
right,
will carry you.
And it was traditional. They were talking about folk and fairy tales, some history,
and they are designed for telling. And if
right.
you know them, and if a traditional story will help you to tell it.
Yes, because it follows, form follows function and all that. So I was interviewed just recently for a journal, a library journal, and they wanted to talk about storytelling art and technique and the stuff that was in the book and the changes, the revisions. And I had to explain to the person I was speaking to, who was a librarian and had worked in libraries for many years, that there was a difference between story time and storytelling. This is not a value difference, right? Because early literacy programming is crucial, but there is a difference between story time and storytelling. And I have to explain that all the time to other librarians, which just is amazing to me. But the growth in storytelling in libraries was actually driven by the women who were working, who were youth services librarians who were telling. And because New York and Pittsburgh, New York had Anne Carroll Moore and Pittsburgh had Frances Jenkins Alcott, And they were very much interested in storytelling, including it in curriculums and making it part of the toolkit of a youth services person that they would be able to just pick up and tell a story uh, anytime. What I've always been interested in is that these women who were telling stories were also collecting them, which is not just from other books, not just compiling anthologies of already printed material, but actually going out and collecting stories. And so and they did this all through the whole 20th century. So it's a really, there's a very strong connection between the librarian teller, the stories that they're telling, and the stories that they're telling and making available. And many of them were collected because they were good to tell. So you have essentially, there is a body of work of stories put together by librarian storytellers that are meant for telling. So if you don't know where to go, just, ask me. I'll send you there.
I'll go to the library.
Really?
But also I'm guessing that then, because even now there is an image of a library where you go in and it's all shh, and having a very stern librarian, you're not allowed to talk. and I have been in very few libraries like that. I have been in libraries like that, university libraries, that are specifically places of study.
Sure.
But community libraries and libraries that are within communities, I've only ever met librarians that want to make that place a hub and a heart place for the community. And if you can bring a welcoming atmosphere, if you have stories, and if you can make that a place that you want to be, and if that place is centered all around books, then it makes books accessible. It makes books warm and friendly and an exciting and safe thing to do. And if you make the library an uncomfortable and cold and unwelcoming place, then you're going to associate that with books as well. And so for me, I mean, that is,
I'm not sure libraries
key reasons to have storytelling within a library,
right?
Because you want a place to be vibrant, friendly, and full of magic and imagination. I mean, that's what a library should be.
I don't disagree. I do disagree with the picture of libraries as being quiet and hushy, because I'm not sure any library was really that. I mean, any public library really was that. When you're in a public library children's room and you are dealing with children are not naturally silent. So it always seemed to be a bit of an overextension to me. But
it's a crazy stereotype that just persists.
And it just won't die. It just will not die. I mean, we beat it to death constantly, but it just won't die. Those women at the turn of the 20th century, the early 20th century, the early 1900s, this was the social service movement in the United States, the kindergarten movement in the States. And women were moving into the workforce in ways that they had not before. And libraries were run by men, and they were not hospitable to children, nor to women being librarians. But you can't keep a good librarian down, And so children's librarians essentially created their own profession and the professional culture that went with it, because nobody was interested in this sort of movement. People weren't sure they wanted children in the library at all, and so children's librarianship was a place for women to work because it was considered a natural extension of the home and the domestic environment, which was the sphere of women at the time. And there was discussion in the professional literature about how to make rooms more comfortable and how to make them more inviting, to invite children. And there were programs even then for mothers, not for fathers, you'll notice, just for mothers, to talk to them about how to raise their children.
Hasn't really changed.
No, it hasn't. So that whole growth in youth services was really created by the women who were working in it. So the women who were teaching in the major training schools for librarianship, the women who were moving into public libraries, who were taking over children's rooms, who were building them, promoting them, inviting children in, creating collections, creating programs that would promote the collections, which is where storytelling came heavily into the mix. And it was just sort of remarkable when you think about it, the way in which they just created their own environment. I have a really good story about Ann Carroll Moore. She was the first head of youth services, the superintendent for youth services at the New York Public Library. And from all accounts, she was a difficult woman. But they were opening a children's room in the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library in Harlem. And she really wanted an African-American librarian there because the whole community was African-American. And so she called Augusta Baker, whose name some people might know, to come in and tell her, look, we really need somebody in this library. We have to develop this collection. We have all these children. And Baker told her, hi, Nicole. Baker said, I applied for a job at the New York Public Library and they didn't take me. She was a big first in many ways, Baker. In many ways, she was the first of a lot of things. But Ann Carroll Moore got up out of her chair and walked into the head of the New York Public Library's office and told him in no uncertain terms that she were in youth services at the New York Public Library, and she thanked him to leave the hiring to her. And she hired Baker, who then went up to this library, went to the library, and one of the first things she noticed was how terrible the collection was how really dreadful the collection was in terms of representation of African Americans and what materials were available for the children in the community. And she started right then in the early 30s, building a new collection. And I think she spent the rest of her career working in that arena, trying to make sure that there was quality representation in the literature. And she was a fine storyteller, Augusta. She was a great storyteller. She wrote Storytelling, Art and Technique. That first edition was from her and Ellen Green.
But it's a really famous book now in the States, isn't it? I mean,
yes.
We've not had it maybe so much over here, but it's kind of the book for
it's the text. It's the library textbook, one of them. Yeah, it's probably it's the big one. And so she I actually got to tell stories with her, if you can believe it. They were dedicating the storytelling room at the Hall Branch Library to Charlemagne Rollins, who was an African-American librarian who also told stories and did some writing, but she was very interested in African-American history because she felt the representation in contemporary children's literature just did not have the information that her children needed, her patrons needed. And so she did a lot of work in the nonfiction arena, biographies and collecting folktales and traditions and things like that. And so they were dedicating the room, and Augusta Baker came because she and Charlemagne had been friends for a long time and came in to tell stories. And I got to tell stories with Augusta. It is one of the high points of my professional career. High points, really. She was remarkable. She was really remarkable. We went out to dinner later, and man, these women, they knew where all the bodies were. It was just, I think about it now, and I'm like, if I had been smarter, I would have had a tape recorder under the table, right? And so I could have recorded this conversation because it was just really astonishing how they knew what they knew and how they operated within the sphere, within the professional sphere. And it was really, they were quite remarkable.
I think things continue. There's still a tradition of remarkable women in librarianship. I mean, you and lots of people here obviously will know Liz Weir, who has also been a very again, I love that you say, oh, she was a difficult woman. Most of the women who get things done, somebody's going to call them difficult. I am sure that there are times that Liz Weir has been called strident. I would call her outspoken. I would call her determined. I would call her stubborn, and I would call her very marvelous. And it does seem to be a place where you can be rooted as a force for change. But
really
it's interesting. That you say about having a tape recorder under the table. It's not something that you would have thought of doing then. That has changed so quickly. And we're talking about the 30s and this change. I don't want to kind of miss all the period in the middle, and I'm really
No,
interested in kind of how libraries supported um, the resurgence of storytelling, but also over that time there's been this huge shift from written books to libraries being a very different place. Kind of, they're
very
not just
different.
books anymore. Now they are all recordings, and there's so much
Sure.
recorded data within them.
There was, I think what happened in New York, and some in Pittsburgh and some out in the West, Seattle had a big training school, and St. Louis. But these librarians were taught, and they took the philosophy of the places where they were taught across the United States, right? New York and Pittsburgh, because they were the big ones early on. And so there was a consistency in terms of how services were being seen professionally and how storytelling was being seen. What New York had that a lot of other places did not have was the ability, they had an institutional memory, because when Anna Coswell Tyler retired, after her, there was another superintendent of storytelling, and then another superintendent of storytelling. And that went on all the way up to Ellen Green in the 70s and 80s. It wasn't until the 80s, I think, that the position was combined with youth services, with being the manager of youth services for the system. But up until then, they used to have winter tales. They used to have big storytelling events, and for the librarians to come in and hear new librarians tell. I mean, there was really a culture, excuse me. There was a culture that really supported that. And so when the storytelling resurgence, I'll go with resurgence, that works for me, came in the 70s in the United States, there was a really hospitable place for people to land, because there were librarians all over the country who knew what storytelling was. I mean, even now you'll hear storytellers say, well, people just don't know what we do. People think we're reading. Look at the cover of Storytelling Art and Technique, on which they have a woman reading a book to young children. Do you know how many times we told them to not do that?
I can imagine.
And not just me. I mean, Ellen was she was not happy the last time that happened. So we still have that notion that people don't understand what we're talking about is telling a story without a text. People take my storytelling class and don't realize that's what they're doing, which is why they get an intro letter before the class starts. Just so you know, this is a presentation class and you will be up on your feet talking a lot. So, which I usually lose at least 2. Each student tells 5 stories in the course of a semester. And that's a lot of stories. But the only way you can learn to tell is to tell and to listen to other people tell. So, yeah. But they hear they have to tell 5 stories and they get very nervous.
So I love that there is still a culture of telling within libraries, and it sounds like there is also a budget to pay for storytellers.
Well, there used to be. There's a lot less money now. I mean, public libraries, although I see some lights of hope in there somewhere. I know that there are a lot of libraries who choose to put their programming money in that arena, right, in storytelling. I always, I'm big on the practical application of theory, right? So if you are going to have a program in a library space, then that program needs to promote the resources that the library contains in order to promote the library in general in the community. Okay, this is like soapbox number, 572. And I don't see any reason to do a program that doesn't do that. And why you don't, and there should be a book list and a book display for every single program that goes on, because and a resource list, because it's just, why would you spend your money on something that doesn't promote the services and resources that you provide? I don't understand that. And storytelling is still a place where money can go that promotes what the library, the resources of the library. So I think some people will actually lean that way on occasion. But first they have to know what storytelling is. And some library schools are still teaching storytelling. Some are not. I know one of the things we talked about was that when did it become information science and not library science?
I was really interested because we were setting this up and I was asking you to come and talk about libraries and storytelling within library service. And then I discovered that your official title doesn't actually have library in it. You are a professor at the School of Information Studies. I was like,
And boy, did
what?
we have a long, that took about 2 years to happen, to change the name of the school, because there was a lot of discussion about it. Partly it was people were looking at falling numbers of students in library schools, and they were getting really nervous. And one of the things they were saying was, well, books are so old fashioned. And libraries did more than books, and they really were more about information and technology. I mean, they were really more about information. Now, all of that happened before the 90s, but once the internet hit in the mid 1990s, it was, I mean, everybody was talking about it. And people who were hanging on to the L word had a pretty hard time of it. It was information, but we debated between information science and information studies. And so we had a whole lot of academic reasons why we went that way. But I think probably it was sort of growing in the 80s, the idea that we should be looking at information science. We should be calling ourselves information scientists, and instead of librarians. And I think it came to a peak after the internet, because people got hysterical. You know, librarians got hysterical after in the mid 1990s. It was amazing to watch. That, oh, the internet
Because
was
I
going to
still think
stop.
that most children, I mean, especially in Britain, it might be different in America. In Britain, children go to the library and they go and see the librarian. They don't go to an information centre and ask the information
No,
scientist.
they don't. They go in and everything is personal. I mean, everything is personal anywhere in the library, but it's particularly if you're working with children. You know, if they have a bad experience with a librarian, they're not coming back. You know, they won't be back there. So it's really important to have somebody who is properly trained and who has the proper attitude when they're working with this age. So because people were so nervous about the internet, and you know, librarians just did what they did all the time. They looked at a new tool, a new information tool, and said, well, how do we use this? Right? How do we use this? How do we bring it into our space? How do we make it helpful to our patrons? You know, so I think they just absorbed technology the same way they did everything else, every other change. They didn't give up anything. So, you know, the workload got a little heavier. I mean, I saw school librarians in particular who suddenly were not in libraries, but were in media centers. And they had to create entire technology plans for a new technology that people really didn't know a whole lot about. And so that was really, it was a very interesting time, the 90s, the late 1990s. And
So
it's,
we're now in the 21st century, and
mm,
this seems like a very simple question, but I don't think it is anymore. I mean, what would you say a library is, and what is storytelling's role in in the library of today?
I think that a library is a communal commitment to intangible values made manifest. I think that in order to communicate the value of the intangible to those who don't recognize that value, librarians, practitioners, and scholars make the tangible transparent and the intangible concrete by telling the stories that illustrate what they do. And it's like the other thing we talked about, which was data. You know, data is great, but data without context is just data. You know, it's only when you put the data within the context of the story that it affects, that data really has any real meaning. So that context is crucial. And the I think that we're not always good at being we're not always masters of our own professional narrative. And I think that sometimes um, that intangibility is problematic for us, because I think it's really um, it's not an easy thing to communicate the value of the intangible in a society that believes that the tangible has the only value. And so that is a very delicate balance. But I think that librarianship in general, ideally, in an ideal situation, they have a long-term commitment to the intangible. They're committed to access and diversity and intellectual freedom. And I mean, those are intangible things, but I'm not sure that libraries would really exist without them, or without the librarians that just won't concede. That just won't concede. And I find as I get older, I'm better at it. Mostly because I think if you don't recognize the value in the intangible, then you and I need to chat. So
what would you say to people that say, well, we don't really need libraries anymore. We've got the internet. You can find anything you need to know on the internet, and that is intangible. Why do we need to pay and maintain a physical space and a profession?
First of all, the internet is not intangible. The internet requires a tremendous amount of tangibility to be useful and functional, because you first have to have the technology, and that digital divide is a real thing. Initially, the thought was that laptops and personal computers were going to lessen that divide, but really what actually has been doing it is smartphones. Because the smartphone that I have in my hand is a more powerful computer than many others, than the original IBMs that took up entire floors of buildings. I think that people who ask that question are people who don't use libraries and who don't know what's happening in a library. So my first response to that is, let's take a walk and let me show you the space, because I think people are not aware of what's available to them. I think they don't see the library as that bridge between the haves and the have-nots, which the library can often become. Many people do not have access to technology at home, especially when we're looking at lower economic stratas who cannot. I mean, technology is expensive. It costs a lot of money. Meanwhile, libraries are circulating hotspots and laptops and making sure that their communities can connect. And librarians are working not just with children, but with adults, particularly adults who've never worked with technology, on how to use technology and what to do and what not to do there. So I really think that question is remarkably ignorant. And I think people who ask it are people who've not used a library maybe ever.
Well, I think it's true. I think there's a lot of people who don't
Yeah.
know what libraries do, who don't know what is on offer there. I mean, like Elaine's put up the most brilliant post in the chat, and she's saying, yay for community libraries. Here in the UK, many of them are offering warm space, free hot drinks, free Wi-Fi, etc., to offer support to people who cannot manage their heating bills in the light of our crashing economy and ridiculous price hikes in gas and electricity. And she says, I hope several of them are doing storytelling. I do feel
like England has turned around and said, here, hold my beer. That I mean,
let's not get into that.
We won't go there. Okay, never mind. I'm sorry.
That's like a hugely big, dreadful conversation that maybe this isn't the space for, and it's just it's terrifying.
Believe me, it's just like I hate to say that you're catching up with us, Amy, but I know. I'm sorry.
And and Janet's just saying, oh, there's a Neil Gaiman quote. Google will bring you back 100,000 answers.
Yeah.
A librarian will bring you back the right one. I love that. I absolutely love that.
And the difference between authoritative information and information that has no that has no source is just how we got into this mess in the first place.
And I have to say, I mean, I've spent a lot of my life in libraries, and I've been very lucky in that I have worked a lot in libraries as well. There has always been, you know, a place for storytellers in libraries in the UK as well. The budget goes up and down. Good librarians do their
Right.
best to try and get storytellers into libraries, and the really good libraries try and make sure that their librarians are there to benefit from it as much as their audience is, so they can learn from having professionals in, and they can sort of have those little chats and little tips and things as well, and disseminate those skills. I've been involved in all sorts of things where I've applied for money or other people have to try and run clubs and courses in libraries, because libraries
Right.
are one of the few safe community spaces. They're one of the few free community
Right.
spaces. They're one of very few places where teenagers can go.
Well, you're
Um,
not expected to buy something.
yeah, I mean, and
Mhm.
there's not a lot of spaces for teenagers. There really aren't. It is a warm, safe place. They can do their homework. They can get support to do their homework, because not all teenagers have support at home to be able to do those things. Not all of them have the technology to be able to do it, and there are so many teenagers that have been rescued by librarians. You know, they've been given that space, and
Yes.
they've had doors open for them. All of those neglected children and teenagers who have nowhere else to go, that can just be set on a different course, that can have their imagination sparked, that can have doors into this whole world of possibilities and support with homework and other things. For me, I mean, I'm so passionate about libraries. I think it's an absolutely crucial, essential space that is constantly under threat. And
It is
then
constantly under threat. And now it's under threat tremendously because the challenges in the United States have increased exponentially over the last couple of years. I mean, we're talking about where it was 100, now it's 4,000, 4,000 challenges. And so the effort to control access to information has increased. And I think that as a professional librarian, you must be able to talk about why the library does what it does. And you need to be able to tell that story to your community, and you have to tell it all the time. And everyone in the library has to be telling the same story, so that when the question arises, do we want the library or don't we? There are a lot of people in the community who come back and say, what do you mean? That's a stupid question, because they understand what libraries are doing in the community. We had one library here that was under siege by people who thought that the library had way too much money and was spending too much money, and they packed the library board and they started cutting and slashing budgets and staff, and the community went nuts. They organized and refused to accept it, and the majority board was very surprised to find out that there were certain things that they were not allowed to do, because there are such things as, I don't know, laws, and you can't break them. So especially if you're in a position of public prominence. So they did a lot of damage to the library, but ultimately somebody left. Now they have a board that's sort of 3-3 split, and they could not agree on who to put into the 7th spot. So the Secretary of State of Illinois stepped in and did it for them. I mean, it's an interesting thing. It's interesting what happens when people start to realize that something is really under attack. Something they value is really under attack. So, but the whole thing comes back to being able to tell that story, tell the library's story in its community, and so that people understand why there's something on the shelf that they don't disagree with, that they don't agree with. What's being challenged now are books by people of color. Authors of color are being challenged. LGBTQ material is being challenged. Anything with sexual content of any kind is being challenged. And there are, I'm going to send roses to the school librarian who sued 2 men who put up on social media that she was a pornographer and was grooming children because she had certain books in her library collection. And she just was done. She was just done. She turned around and said, You can't just say anything you want and get away with it. And she sued them. So I'm waiting to find out. It's going into its second round now, so we'll see what happens there.
Mm.
But
It's a really interesting point from Mariana Cotta saying, I worry the way we frame libraries as a place for people who need refuge from whatever makes them weirdly on some level more
right.
vulnerable because the political climate is such that budgets should be slashed and handouts curtailed. Oh, that makes me so
I
nervous.
understand that. I really
I
do.
get
And
it. Yeah. I mean, and it isn't just for people that are vulnerable. It's a place.
no, and people are
It should be
vulnerable,
a
not just
neutral. Sorry.
they're not vulnerable just in terms of economics or homelessness, although certainly that is a very vulnerable population. But we also have people who are vulnerable because they live alone. We have children who are vulnerable because they don't have access to books or um, people who read books to them. One of the first things they talk about in early literacy is that you should have a print-rich environment. And some children just don't have that unless they come into a library space. So the vulnerabilities range from actual physical vulnerabilities to intellectual ones. And so there's a wide range, but I totally get, Marianne, I totally get what you're saying there. What
Again,
I'm amazed is that the political challenges to library budgets haven't been greater, that there haven't been more of them. But there have been places like the library I was just talking about where the board decided the library just was spending too much money, libraries are probably the most fiscally conservative public institutions like anywhere. So I mean, they know how they spend their money and where they put it. So and they can tell you. And that's part of that transparency, right? The transparent story. Here's what we do, here's why we do it, and here's how much it actually costs. I had a library in I think it was Elgin once, who put up a display in the lobby about what it cost to get to purchase and process a book and put it on the shelf. It's a very interesting explanation of where the money goes.
I think
So
I think that's great, and I
right.
think, and that is but it's one of the joys of a library as well, is that it is a space that people do meet. You can go from any
Right.
background, any class, and it's again, it's one of those places where old and young can meet and be in a space together, and it's okay. And usually with a little bit of time, maybe. So, I mean, just like in our local library, of course there's all the books, but there's also the computers. There's often like a puzzle out, just a jigsaw
Right.
puzzle. And so, and everybody will have a go. And so you can
Mhm.
end up with people who've never talked to each other before, and you can end up with a
Right.
7-year-old with a 70-year-old who are both trying to do this puzzle together, who wouldn't get the opportunity to talk to each other, because it is much harder, and it's much harder for people to reach out to children, and it's much harder for children to
Right.
reach out to adults because of so many, well, obvious things, but that because of a very small minority, it's put huge factors into our society. And I think that a
Small
library is
but
one of the
loud.
few places that you can reach out across those
Small but
boundaries.
loud. And the thing is that libraries aren't just, we were talking about the libraries without walls in the 80s, right? In the 1980s. But now your community now in your library goes far beyond your own geographic area, because now we are talking about ways that we are linked technologically that we have never been linked before. And libraries are part of that effort to make the world bigger. Libraries are supposed to make the world bigger, not smaller. So so I think that that's something to consider. The idea that your community isn't just your local physical community, but really the community, but the world community. Because if we don't start thinking about it that way, there's trouble ahead. Um, trouble ahead. So I'm interested in seeing how that plays out, how the libraries without walls plays out in the technological arena. I don't think you can say, well, This actually happened to me in a library once. I was going in to evaluate a collection, and I was going through the picture books, and they had no picture books with people of color in them. And I said, and so why is that? I asked the librarian. And she said to me, oh, well, those people don't come in here. And I just went,
I wonder
and
why.
can we think of perhaps the reason why they might not come in here? Let's think about that for a minute. And that was decades ago, but I still run into that we collect for our community. It's like, but your community is much bigger now. And your responsibility to that community is much bigger now. I think it's important for collections to reflect the world as it exists. Not this make-believe world that people would like to exist. And that radical inclusivity is the only way to do that. And that becomes another huge point, right? In terms of the stories that we tell.
I think radical inclusivity is a lovely point to kind of pause on. We are almost out of time, but we do
I know,
have
I can't
some
believe
time.
it.
I have a huge raft of questions and things that I would still really like to talk about, but
Okay.
I promised that there would be a Q&A. I promised to open it up. So this is your chance, people, to get a question in before I just kind of go rah, 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 and ask all the rest of my questions as well. So if you have a question that you want to ask, if there's something that you've been wanting to discuss and ask Janice, this is your moment. Get typing on that keyboard, because otherwise I will kind of be nudging on.
You know, one of the things that we talk about in storytelling classes is telling stories from cultural groups of which you are not a member. And it takes a little while to say, first of all, every story takes some thought, right? Every story takes some thought. But if you are a member of the majority culture and you are looking at material from a cultural group that has been historically oppressed, then your best bet is to take a step back and just not, which is really a radical, which is a surprising thing to say. But because what I've seen is a lot of people who have the same opinion that every story should be available to every teller are not talking to tellers from those communities. It doesn't do any good for me to talk to you about how we should be able to tell Native American tales. What we need to do is talk to somebody who comes from that community, because cultural groups have very different ideas about story and whose story belongs to and how it belongs.
I think that is absolutely, well, we can talk about that for quite a long, and we have talked. There are previous episodes we've touched on that, and I'm sure we will again. But we do have some questions, Janice. So,
shoot.
Karen
Okay.
is asking, do you?
Yes, Karen, I do.
Yeah. Do you see storytelling as activism? Yes. There we go.
I think it quite possibly can. I think it quite possibly can be, and there are many groups and organizations that are working in that direction, that are trying to control the narrative, create the narrative that will be that will be most beneficial to people who need the benefits. Right. So
interestingly,
yes.
I would never. I don't tell Native American stories. I don't have the right. Haven't been given any. I wouldn't do it. However, I would read. If I was in a library, I would very happily read a Native American story from a Native American book by a Native American teller to a child, because that child is maybe not very likely to meet someone with a Native American background, particularly not. I live in rural Shropshire, and that is one of the few places that I would do that. And if I was asked if we were talking about that, then we can go and look on the shelves, show how to use a library, and share that together and explore it together. And I think that is one of the beautiful things about a library, that there are different rules within the library. It's very different reading and sharing a book than it would be taking the story out of that book and telling it from my point of view.
And I've seen this discussion on storytelling boards, and where a lot of people from the majority culture come to the conclusion, once again, that as long as they respect the story, it's perfectly okay to tell any story that they want. And I'm just like, okay, this is, first of all, overly simplistic. And second of all, you can't just talk to each other. You have to talk to people who are from those communities and find out how they feel about story, and how, because some groups believe that stories are cultural property. So if you are telling a story from a particular Native American community, for example, unless you have permission, it's theft. And
Yeah.
as Gay Ducey once said, Gay Ducey's a storyteller from California. Gay Ducey once said, sometimes the answer is no. You don't get to do anything you want. That's part of growing up, which makes me
Well,
be very concerned occasionally.
knowing when no means no is something
Right.
that a lot of people have to learn on a lot of different levels and places.
Levels.
So Norman's asking, what are your thoughts on a library dedicated solely to storytelling?
Repeat that, please.
What are your thoughts on a library dedicated solely to storytelling?
Oh, it's the dream of my life, Norman. I have to tell you how many times I have built that library in my head. I have built that library so many times. I've not only built it, I've staffed it, and I've organized the collection. I can't tell you how many times I've built that library. We have a collection. Yes, this is the room where the folk and fairy tales live, right? This wall and that wall. The other books are in the other room.
We've brought our own personal libraries with us this evening. We both have our own storytelling libraries. And I do have, while we're just here, is I do have several shelves that are dedicated to librarians, and like you were saying, there are many. It's very interesting how the style changes as time goes by.
Yes,
but storytelling really has always been associated with libraries. So this is one of my library corners. So from the amazing Eileen Caldwell, who still has very much to say about storytelling to us.
Oh dear.
And we have our equivalent of Baker. So the one of the librarians that I was absolutely delighted to meet and to tell with, who was just an absolute star of the storytelling scene when I first got involved, was Grace Hallworth, who did a huge amount for stories of people of colour and bringing stories from different places. And if I can put my hand on it relatively easy, mouth open, story jump out is on my African shelf somewhere. Can I reach it?
Oh, Norman, I'm coming to your house.
Anyway, Grace Hallworth is another librarian to really check out. And of course, we mentioned Liz Weir and her, again, carrying on that tradition all through the 20th century of collecting stories.
Really?
In that position of a librarian where you have access to people, because the thing about stories is you tell a story, you get stories back. You get out a book, you start talking about stories, people will tell you them back. So I highly recommend as well Boom Chicka Boom by Liz Weir. That is absolutely kind of Liz Weir collecting the stories of people that came into her when she was working as a librarian.
I do want to say something to everyone, but particularly to our Canadian friends. One of the first storytellers I ever heard at the National Festival was Alice Kane. And she was just remarkable. And nobody knew who she was. So she was in a smaller tent that would seat maybe about 600. And there were maybe 250 people there. And she was, even then, a little frail. But she got up in a pastel blue suit and she stood on the stage and she had one hand on a stool and the microphone in front of her. And she told Irish folk tales and fairy tales. And you couldn't have heard, the tent was absolutely silent. I mean, there was all this ambient noise outside, but inside that tent, we were in this bubble that Alice Kane created. And it was remarkable to watch her stand and deliver, right? Just stand and deliver a story with such conviction and it was as if she was in the story she was telling, and she took everybody there with her. It was remarkable. And I remember walking out of the tent and thinking, okay, I want to do that when I'm old. I want to be doing that when I'm her age. I want to be doing that kind of storytelling. But she was really quite amazing. And it was a funny contrast between, say, Alice and Augusta Baker, because the New York Public Library gets a, oh, well, they were so stiff and they never delivered. They weren't animated. And I'm like, honey, have you ever heard Augusta Baker tell a story? I mean, I was in the room with her, and she was an incredibly animated teller, and very inclusive in getting the audience to participate in the stories that she was telling. And it was two really brilliant tellers who had completely different styles of presentation, which didn't make either of them less brilliant. It was an education.
Yes, it would be very boring if everybody was the same.
Really.
We are just about out of time. But I do have one more question.
Okay.
Because you now, as I understand, you don't work in the library now. You work training the librarians of tomorrow.
Right.
And you are then sending them out into the world. So what future do you see for the librarians that you are training? Are there going to be enough jobs for them? And what are you training them to go and do?
I think that ever since I got into this profession, which was in 1981, libraries have been closing, and librarians were going to be out of jobs, and books were dying. And that's been 40 years. And librarians are not going without, and books are not dying. Some libraries are closing. I believe that those libraries don't tell their story very well. They need to do a better job at telling their story. So there are a couple of my students who are on this, who are here actually. I think that we train them to create community. Is the big answer. Is that libraries, storytelling are where community happens. And as you said earlier, it's one of the few places in a community where you can go in and there are a tremendous number of resources available to you, and you are not expected to buy anything. And I don't see that disappearing the way that some people do. Mostly because I talk to librarians and I'm in libraries all the time. And I find that people who don't understand the value of libraries are people who do not use them. And so I think we need to start there.
And I think that is the perfect place to wrap it up. Train your librarians to create communities, and libraries and storytelling are the way that you do that. And that is why libraries and storytelling are so integrally connected to each other. And how, if you've got a library and a storyteller, then that is where the heart of the community is, I think. So you're getting invitations here, Janice, to tell stories on online platforms. So yeah, Janice is available. I mean, Janice is online. You can find Janice. She has given me a whole load of links after I gave her some prompting. Of course, I think that is the bit of paper that you may have just heard fall on the floor, was all the links. But you can find, Janice has written so many books. She has a fantastic CD out. She has a website. You can find her on Facebook. Wow. I will put the links on the when I edit this, come back to the YouTube channel, and it will all be on there. And I'll try and put them on my Facebook channel as well, but they'll be on the YouTube in the notes for tonight, and then you can find the links and you can go to them. And keep thinking, because there are, I mean, like, please do explore, Janice. Yeah, I've got my list. So there's Folk Tales Aloud, practical tips for playful storytelling. She's written Engaging Teens with Story, How to Inspire and Educate Youth with Storytelling. And of course, Storytelling Art and Technique, the
That
text
was
in
that was
America.
hard.
And we didn't talk about doing the revised 5th edition
It was
and all the
hard too,
problems of that.
because I love Ellen so much. Ellen Green took over from Augusta Baker, and Ellen was really a gentle soul and very remarkable in her telling, and didn't want to know from technology, like even a little. And it was just
So,
like, okay, Ellen, I'm keeping this in. I had Ellen Green's favorite books, but the technology is in there now.
well, and this has been one of the exciting things. I think watching the editions of that book over the years really shows the evolution of libraries. Now it includes technology. Now there's a whole chapter, I think, on diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, there
It's
is.
a really important book. So lots of places for you to explore. Um, and yes, Joe, yes, please do share the recordings. So all the recordings, all the episodes of Taking the Tradition On, I will just like top and tail this. I'll take the little, tidy it up just a little bit. But all the episodes of YouTube, I have my own little library on my channel. There is an archive of all the episodes of Taking the Tradition On. They are all free. You can watch them whenever you like. And there's just amazing people over the last couple of years. So it's not about me, but I mean, I have been very lucky to talk to some really amazing people, including Janice. So just go and explore. And if you like it, please do subscribe to it, and just and have an explore. I will be back the first Tuesday of next month, and every month. That is when Taking the Tradition happens. It is the first Tuesday of every month. The next one will be the 6th of December. And Mariana Cotta, I can see, is been here with us tonight and listening to Janice Del Negro. Mariana Cotta is going to be my guest. We're carrying on with Words in the Works, and we're going to be digging deep into storytelling and archaeology. It's going to be just a fantastic night.
Cool.
Mariana Cotta is an anthropologist, she's an archaeologist, she's a presenter, she's an adventurer. She has also got lots of completely marvellous books out. This is what I have been dipping into lately. It is an absolute fabulous book. All kinds of amazing artifacts, all kinds of amazing places, the stories that go with them, stories of the land, traditional stories, how you put the pieces of things together to make them into a coherent narrative. She's gracing us with her presence. Usually she has a much bigger audience. She's normally properly on the telly, doing Time Team and Mystic Britain. So we're going to have an hour just really exploring that. So I will be inviting you. If you signed up to the Facebook event, I'll invite you to that next month. Come along. If you can't make it on the first Tuesday, don't worry, because as ever, you will be able to explore it on the web, on the YouTube channel afterwards. Thank you so much to all of you for coming and listening tonight and for being part of the conversation. And of course, thank you to my amazing, erudite, thoughtful guests. We could have gone on for hours, as always. I'm sorry to have to bring it to a close. Well done, and thank you to the amazing Janice Del Negro.
Thanks very much. I can talk about storytelling in libraries anytime. Anytime you want.